This episode, I'm joined by Daniel Schwindt to discuss his book, The Case Against the Modern World, a crash course in traditionalist thought, alongside discussions on Catholicism, liberalism, and traditionalism. I'd like to say a big thank you to all my paid patrons and subscribers for making all of this work possible, and if you would like to support Hermitix podcast or become part of the community, please find links in the description below. Enjoy. Okay, so Daniel Schwindt, thanks very much for joining us on Hermitix podcast.
Yeah, it's good to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
We are going to be discussing your book, which is one of quite a lot, but it's your book, The Case Against the Modern World, a crash course in traditionalist thought. So really this discussion will be about traditionalist thought, traditionalist authors, and how, concepts such as liberalism, conservatism, democracy, how these are understood in traditionalist thought. But before we jump in with that, just tell us a bit about yourself and how this book came about.
Sure. I am located in the United States, very centrally located in the United States, rural area. So I'm not a credentialed academic. I've worked fairly normal jobs all of my life. I did have aspirations early on. I thought that I wanted to be a professor of philosophy. It took precisely one graduate level course to show me that was decidedly not the case. And so I sort of abandoned that. And this book, The Case Against the Modern World, is really, I suppose it just displays my way of reading other books. And that is really how it came about. I had published several other books prior, in the years previous, but this book was really written without actually thinking about writing a book. The way it is structured is maybe a quote or a citation from another author, and my comments or elaboration added on, and maybe connecting the dots. And that's really the way that I read and try to commit things to memory and organize my notes. And what was happening was I had really been trying to explore. I had discovered traditionalist thought. I had discovered writers like René Guénon, Fritjof Schwann, and wanted to sort of cover the range of thinkers who could be roughly grouped with them, or at least the range of ideas that would be typical of a, quote, traditionalist thinker. And so I was doing that, and I was gathering different authors together and my notes in that way. And when I kind of stepped back and looked at it, I had kind of a compendium already put together. And so I just thought if I organized it a little bit into sections topically, that it could be published as that, and maybe be, useful to someone else who just wanted to encounter these ideas and not necessarily read, all of Julius Evola's body of work, which is a little bit daunting and not always enjoyable. And so this format would give you a little bit of an idea of the ideas and which authors you might want to pursue to explore things more deeply.
Okay. Are you a full-time author now, or is this sort of a side thing?
No, I work in marketing, actually, and so I write when I can. There was a time when I did try to move into writing full time, but no. Now I work a day job and I write it at night, and maybe when no one else is looking.
So do you mind if I ask what was it about the sort of the undergraduate philosophy course where you just thought, nope, this isn't for me?
Well, it just You know, James, in your book, you, I believe, at one point described a PhD as an understanding that was a mile deep and an inch wide. And you may not have meant that, about every PhD or every academic who, some of them you can have very wide ranging insights and very wise thinkers. But I think to get the credential in most cases, you have to at least be able to narrow yourself and show that kind of, I guess, within that constraint of going a mile deep and an inch wide. And there was just certain things about the mentality from talking to professors that it made it clear that wasn't the home that I thought it was going to be for me. Not necessarily a total condemnation against academia, but not my place.
No, yeah, I can sympathize with that feeling. A lot of my later academia was distance learning, so I didn't have to sort of take part. I think I preferred it that way. So before we jump in with the book, I do have to ask you the Hermitix question, which is you can place 3 thinkers, living or dead, into a room and listen in on the conversation. Who do you pick?
Yeah, so that was kind of a hard question because the most significant thinkers in terms of maybe writers who have influenced me the most, or those few writers who you are not the same person after you finish reading them, after you experience their work, and one was Henry Miller, who was Tropic of Capricorn, Tropic of Cancer. After I read those in my late 20s, that was huge. However, I feel like if I put Henry Miller in a room, I would love to hear him talk, but I don't know that anyone else would get any talking in. That guy just had too much to say. And another one was Cormac McCarthy, who was huge when I went through all of his books. But I think I'd want to hear him if I put him in a room, and I don't know who I'd want him to talk to. So as far as putting three thinkers in a room whose conversation I would just love to be a fly on the wall, I would say sort of the two big titans of the traditionalist school, if you want to call it that, René Guénon and Frithjof Schuon. So those two, and then a contemporary, Jean Borella. Are you familiar with him?
I'm not familiar with Borella, no.
Okay, so he's a French philosopher, theologian, and he is sort of a traditionalist writer, but he has spent a lot of time critiquing René Guénon's positions regarding Christianity, and he wrote a book called Christ, the Original Mystery, and it's a very, very thick book, very dense, but it does an excellent job of sort of answering René Guénon's, I guess, general dismissiveness towards Christianity. And from a Catholic point of view, it answers a lot of his objections. René Guénon was, like others in the traditionalist school, seemed to be a little bit fixated on the East and East versus West type of dichotomy. I mean, they were all fairly universalist and showed great insight into all the traditional religions, but it was always, Hinduism is the most fully developed doctrine, and, a pretty obvious condescension toward Catholicism in particular, as just not really having a metaphysics and being too sentimental. So acknowledged as one of the main traditional religions, but they would spend most of their time exploring Hinduism and maybe Islam. And so having Jean Borella there with his powerful mind, it would be a very interesting conversation to hear them go back and forth, because Rene Guénon was not challenged very, very frequently, at least not in any conversations that we have recorded.
So is that where you think that conversation would immediately go to, is to straight away Borella would be challenging Guénon?
Yes, I believe so, because that's just mostly because of Guénon, and there's a couple conversations that are recorded, and he kind of goes straight on the offensive, and since most of Borella's work has been correcting Guénon's excesses, I think that would be not hostile, but very productive dialogue.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And what about Thrift of Schwindt? What do you think he would be commenting on in that room?
So he was a Swiss thinker who, like Guénon, spent a lot of time writing on comparative religion, and eventually sort of settled in Islam. And he would be helpful because he sort of carried on to a greater degree everything. He came a little bit after Guénon, and they were friends. But after Guénon passed away, Schwindt sort of wrote a book critiquing some of his ideas and things that he didn't really have a desire to do while Guénon was alive. And so I think just with the three of them together, it would provide a very balanced and complete picture. And some of it is my own prejudiced interest, selecting Borella because I am Catholic. And one of the challenges for me dealing with all of these writers was, again, that slight dismissiveness towards Christianity, as it's great, it's legitimate, its doctrines are very highly developed and traditional, but sort of insufficient from an initiatory and a metaphysical standpoint. What Borella's work did for me was, being a committed Catholic and enjoying that doctrinal development, but also, enjoying Guénon. There was always a little bit of friction moving back and forth intellectually between Guénon and Fritjof Schwindt's writings, and then the Catholicism which I embraced, and I never really accepted the dismissiveness there, the condescension towards Christianity, but again, I didn't quite have the tools and theological equipment to reconcile them and to correct the errors that were there. And Borella did a fantastic job of sort of allowing me to synthesize the two and be at home in sort of a coherent framework with all of those authors.
Okay. I'm sure those people, especially Guénon, will come back in as we sort of discuss traditionalism. But we sort of have to start somewhere. And it seemed to me that, reading through your book, that one of the sort of, I guess you could call it like a node or an anchor, where the discussion of traditionalism is always thinking back to or revolving around, is the concept of liberalism, or being a liberal, or being liberal, which is, something which is a term which is thrown around today, which I think basically has become synonymous with just like, oh, they're liberal, they're a good person, or they're progressive, or whatever that means. But it's a bit of an empty statement these days. So why do you think it is, from your research, that this term liberal has come to have such a wide range of meanings? And I guess, what did it originally mean then for the traditionalists as well?
Mm-hmm. And I think that the reason traditionalist thought in its critiques and conceptual ranges spends a lot of time on liberalism is because that sort of is I suppose the core of the modern mentality, modern political philosophies. And the traditionalists will spend a lot of time, picking things apart between the traditional world and the modern world. or the traditional worlds and the modern world. And the modern world is characterized by liberalism. And so, although it does seem to be kind of a drop in levels, because liberalism isn't addressing itself to religion and metaphysics, it's doing it, sort of in a negative way through the absence of, a concern for religion and metaphysics. And that was, of course, the reason it was being attacked, because traditionalists thought, everything hinges on religion. And then if you remove religion from the hierarchy of the social body, then everything else falls apart. And so that's why, we would seem to move from guys who spend most of their time in doctrinal nuance down to a political idea. And so liberalism itself, it being so hard to pin down, and I think that's mostly because it is, the root liberty, the root meaning of the word liberty is one of those things that it has no real positive meaning, or it's difficult to populate with positive meaning. It can mean anything that the speaker means it to mean. And, the absence of restraint, something like that. And of course, since most of the time it sets itself up as an opposition to something else, to its opposite, tyranny, slavery. Of course, everyone is for liberty, and so everyone is for liberalism, and so but it remains vague. It remains sort of meaningless, and that's why I'm not precisely sure what liberal means, there in the UK, for example, or elsewhere right now. I know that here in the United States we have, it's this two-party, liberals versus conservatives, and so here it's the impression is that we have a liberal party and a conservative party, in which we do not, and anyone who reads much history on the subject knows that, so that's not an earth-shattering claim. But it just shows the flexibility of that term, that here in the United States we have liberalism and nothing else. We are a country, that the Declaration of Independence is almost a plagiarization of John Locke, the father of liberalism. And so we are a liberal nation, and we just have right liberals, left liberals, liberals who prefer to, be liberals in certain very limited ways and not in others, and, two teams that act in that way. And so I think just the vagueness of the term, and anytime you have a term that is almost impossible to define, that is also pleasing, that it's going to cause trouble.
Mm-hmm. The impossibility of definition is sort of a contemporary Western trait, especially with words such as progress and things along these lines that just get bandied around as ways to sort of vaguely state that we're doing the right thing. But do you as a religious person, do you see liberalism as becoming the new religion? Do you think it has its own myths and rituals? Do we worship it in the same way as we would a sort of a hierarchical religious structure?
Yes and no. We do, in the sense that publicly speaking, all of the sentiments, if man is unavoidably religious and will express those sentiments, if he needs rituals, needs religious objects to show reverence to, and you can't just remove that from the public sphere. You create a vacuum, and those impulses have to be directed somewhere. And that's been described as a migration of the sacred. And so what has happened is that those impulses and the old religious objects were removed, and so they've been targeted on secular objects. And so I guess it might be doing an injustice to religion to say that the American flag is a religious object, but from a certain point of view, yes, it is treated, with the same sentiments. The way you treat the object sort of makes it very clear what kinds of impulses you are acting on, and the requirement of a prescribed posture when you are showing honor to the flag, to this object, that outrages the population if you do not adopt the prescribed posture beyond any rational level of outrage. The strict procedures that must be followed, this object must be disposed of in a certain way. Anytime there's burial rites attached to a physical object, you're probably, getting into the sphere of religion and not, just ordinary life. And so I'm using the flag as one example, but especially recently, here in the United States, there was this storming of the Capitol. And now all of a sudden you see language from, the left, who usually stays as far away as they can from religious terminology. All of a sudden they're complaining that these people who stormed the Capitol desecrated the building. Desecrated. It's all over the headlines on the internet. And I mean, desecrate, that is by definition disrespect to a sacred place or thing. And so, again, I guess in those ways, it is sort of capitalizing on man's religious impulses, but directing them to secular objects.
So then the problem really then for religious people, believers, is that isn't a true religion, because there isn't actually any grace or divinity behind anything that's being said to be religious, right? Right. It co-opts the religious feeling so that, when you're expressing those things in your daily life towards secular objects, then it feels odd to express them where they're supposed to be expressed. And religion becomes this, you move from, the old Greek hylomorphism, where man is body and soul, and there is no such thing as a disembodied religion. It must be, it must have root and branch in the immanent world. And what you have, now, and what the traditionalist complaint would be about liberal civilization with the separation of church and state, would be that religion is told, stay within the heart of the believer. It's a purely private affair, and religion just can't work that way. It's not just soul; it can't be disembodied. And when you're forced to do that, it's very confusing. It sort of truncates your religious life in such a way that it is, I suppose, impotent. Maybe not for you, in your prayer life, although, my position would be that yes, it would be pretty limiting even, for what you pursue internally if you aren't able to express that in a communal sense. But, and so that's sort of where we are. Mm-hmm. So do you think liberalism overcomes those authentic religious experiences? Do you think it organically they just fall away when liberalism moves into society, or do you think liberalism actively wants to destroy and remove those authentic religious impulses?
I think that liberalism, as far as Thomas Jefferson was pretty specific about hating the influence that the clergy has ever had on, public policy. And whatever rhetoric there has been in, American history or in the history of, post-Enlightenment liberal philosophers about, we're separating religion from the state because we want religion to thrive, and this is a better way for religion to thrive, and it will have more influence on government if we separate it in this way. I think that that's mostly just rationalization in an attempt to not say, what is really meant, which is a terror of religion as an actual potent social force, as an authority that might actually be able to directly influence policy. I think it was Jefferson that said something to the effect that the priest has always and everywhere been the enemy of liberty. And so I don't really see how whatever else has been said about, church and state separate so that the church can thrive. I think that was just sort of a flattering justification that seems to make sense to most people and gets them to buy it, because if they had really said, we want religion, to express itself in our society as little as possible, that wouldn't have been quite as popular.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do you think that move away from tradition is strictly correlated with the move away from divine authority? So as we move away from tradition into liberalism, there is just a removal of tradition, or do you think those traditions are reappropriated in liberalism in some form? I mean, I definitely can't see much tradition these days, but I'm wondering do you think there's still some there, but it's just been a bit mutated by liberalism, or do you think that liberalism just has nothing to do with tradition in that sense?
Yeah, so I would say that the successes of liberalism, are always at the expense of tradition, which is tied up with divine authority. You're always moving away from divine authority when liberalism is put in place. And I think that, maybe something that should be mentioned as central or at the core of liberalism, and the only way that any of it can make sense is through individualism, which is, just emphasis on the individual as a self-contained unit, as opposed to the maybe more traditional view that the individual is to some extent incomplete without being in society with others, and cannot fulfill himself left to his own devices. That would have been absurd. And so, and in order to have the traditional society where you pursue a common good that focuses on man's final end, which is bliss, you have to have that divine authority. And liberalism being individualistic, it sort of makes all of that nonsensical. And so American individualism in particular, just because it's been talked about so much here by famous writers and almost worshipped here, and that was one of the things that struck Tocqueville so much, was the emphasis on individualism and how far that has been taken. And directly to your question, I mean, he said that individualism, which sort of encourages each individual to trust in themselves, or at least tries to convince them, even though that's very difficult to actually do. But Tocqueville said that American individualism told the individuals that they were, the ultimate source of truth, that they needed to trust themselves first and foremost, retreat into the ego, and that what the end result was to train everyone mentally to sort of only accept what is immediately understandable, sort of what is obvious, what is common sense. And this, his phrasing was that this gave Americans an invincible distaste for the supernatural. And so, from his point of view, that liberal individualism led almost directly to materialism.
Mm-hmm. So at the same time, liberalism's trying to promote the idea that sort of we are all an individual God, but at the same time we're a God of a world where there isn't really anything that's actually divine, that we're just a material world which we are truly the controller of.
Right, and I think that to some extent it's not. Liberalism wouldn't say any of that, and most of the philosophers wouldn't say that, but that's the result. That's not part of the explicit philosophy, but that is the outcome for sure.
And do you think that's why that, I mean, I didn't actually see it as connected to this question that I had until now, but do you think that that's how this sort of contemporary attitude, I mean, if you think it's just contemporary, I mean, I don't think it's been in history as much as it has now, but this attitude that absolutely every single choice we make, every part of our agency can in some way be connected to a political action or political choice. I've joked before about, buying the right vegetables, if they're organic, is a political choice, driving the right car, living in the right place, having the right opinions. Absolutely every facet of our life now, in the West at least, can be seen as a political thing. And do you think that introduction of politics into daily life is that liberal control mechanism where you sort of think that you're truly in control because you're constantly making these choices, but actually they are really controlled by something else?
Yes, and I think there's really something to that. I mean, when you sort of maybe don't explicitly exclude religion but ignore it, then politics sort of becomes the thing that colors all of your actions, because they can't be just your religion, the way you live your life, or your sort of values. The highest level of value is a set of political ideas, and so everything has reference to that, and so it's just not treated with the same distance. You can't step back from politics because politics is what's there. It's the center of reference value. I think propaganda too has probably a big influence on that problem. Just the technological society that we live in, and the fact that everyone is, bombarded 24 hours a day with these ideas and these value statements that ultimately have reference to the political, but just being subject to that. But so that may not be, maybe a consequence of liberal materialism, working itself out by the development of those technologies, but sort of an accidental consequence.
Mm-hmm. And that sort of focus for liberalism on our common sense reality, even though the sort of contemporary pathways we've taken under liberalism. I mean, you list sort of Freud and Darwin as two clear examples. Both, Darwin's theory of evolution, where we sort of a lot of our agency is lost to just this natural selection, just this natural process we have no say in, and then Freud sort of completely desentenced even our own minds. What we believe is actually part of a layered psychological apparatus of subconscious and ego, id, etc. And do you think that these are sort of liberalism sort of latches onto these figures because they continually remove anything which might be a higher level of understanding, even if it isn't God? It might be something such as, like I put in the question, a life philosophy, sort of a worldview, a vitality, something other than just an acceptance of a liberal containment where we go, okay, we're just at the whim of these material forces, and so we best, all that matters is this world now. Do you think that's why these thinkers especially have been sort of broadcast as the figureheads of liberalism?
Oh, yes. I think it was Viktor Frankl said something to the effect that we're nihilists, but our nihilism is not centered on nothingness. It's centered on nothing butness. And that's what everything expresses is, he said, I think, not that the, scientists, the problem is not that the scientists are specializing, but that the specialists are generalizing. And, that would be, Freud, at least leading us to believe, or people, whether or not he said it explicitly, but that everything we do is based on, libido, everything from, your actions to your thoughts themselves. And Descartes, Tocqueville said that Americans, America was the place where Descartes' ideas were least studied, but most thoroughly put into practice, as far as everyone being, trusting in their own ego first and foremost, and what they can perceive about it, and no external authority of any kind. And so, you could go all over the board picking out these thinkers who were sort of in every single area, and at about the same time in history, carrying out this nothing butness. I mean, there's Martin Luther in the sphere of religion. I mean, what else are the solas? Scripture alone, faith alone. Those are statements of nothing butness. And so that is a kind of expression of nihilism in the religious sphere that we're going to make it as simple as possible by reduction. And Newton in physics, and so it goes on, and not just the ones that you mentioned, and back to I suppose Locke, who sort of did it in the political philosophy area as well, and then you get the United States sort of built on that.
Huh. And that, now it's sort of becoming clear to me as to why we're always compelled to, well, not so much myself, and I don't know about you, but compelled to defend democracy to our dying breath. It is absolutely the sort of the primary principle that apparently holds everything together. I think if people want to try defend something that they're undertaking on a global or national scale, they always try get in the word that we need to defend democracy and uphold democracy. And, it now becomes clear to me that that's because democracy is the sort of illusion that everyone gets their own individual say. But of course, that's not entirely true. But, do you think there's any more to that? Or do you think that's why democracy is sort of liberalism's almost baby that they have to keep promoting?
Mm-hmm. Well, and, our discussion about the migration of the sacred, and I think democracy is sort of the idea that is, so I suppose the central gospel, making the world safe for democracy is the secularized expression of, a gospel message of evangelism. And, it, in a sense, these things are also, unconscious. And that is also part of the problem with the migration of the religious impulse to sacred things, is that you lose all accountability. There's a sort of embarrassment when you do something violent or excessive in the name of religion. And we all have sort of a healthy distaste for whenever that happens. When you have unconsciously migrated those impulses to the sacred or the secular, you can get away with a lot more because you're not holding yourself accountable to anything. And so your policies, your global ventures, your interventions, in other ages where everything was done on the basis of, an explicit religious motivation, you would have had to say, this is a crusade, but you don't. If you don't, if there's no such thing as a crusade and no religious motivation for you. And so in a way you can get by without ever having to admit to yourself that that's the kind of person you are and that's what you're doing.
So democracy is actually, do you see it as quite forceful then, that it's making people believe something which is actually really to their detriment, because it actually removes more freedom than it could ever give?
Mm-hmm. Well, and by casting off, he talked about casting off divine authority, and, what democracy tells this now individualized citizen who is more alone, left to his own devices from a mental standpoint, at least theoretically, and told, our political structures, everything we do, every aspect of society involves you, and you therefore must be concerned about it. I don't think we realized, and even the first few times I read about it, it took a while for it to sink in how revolutionary that really was, that sense of feeling and having to sort of feel responsible for everything. And, democracy tells me and, you that you can't claim ignorance about global warming or, vaccinations or the problem in the Middle East or tax rates or anything like that. And, some of us are more or less well-read on maybe one or two of these things, but I don't think it's a stretch to say that there's only a few people in the United States, maybe in the world, that are capable of saying, actually, this is the general problem, in these Middle Eastern areas, and here's, the best way to deal with it, or not deal with it, and so on and so forth. And just to put those questions in front of the average person on the street, and which again includes me, and in a lot of these questions, I am the average person on the street, and say that I need to pick a side. That's very distressing to me. And I've learned to say no, I won't, but for the most part, due to, democracy being the highest moral value, if you don't participate, that is, what in the religious sphere would be, not going to church. Not voting is to neglect one of your highest duties and to sort of, not care about life and about the common good. So all of those things that would have been sort of religious participations. So I guess we've talked about sort of the idols of secular religion, the flag, the buildings, but rituals would be things as simple as voting, which have massive consequences for the conscience of the person who does it. And so just the pressure that everyone feels is, it starts off in flattery that you have the power to do this. You're more empowered than any other, citizen, any other member of any other society throughout history. You should be so thankful. You have it better than anyone else. And then you're presented with responsibility for these questions that you couldn't possibly answer. And so what happens is that you do exactly what I suppose the peasant or someone would have done in the Middle Ages. You have to look to an outside authority. But instead of doing it consciously by acknowledging that this authority that you're looking for is the one responsible for these decisions, you end up turning on the television or scrolling your social media feed. And so you get you turn to all of these authorities sort of in a context of chaos, and never once acknowledging that you actually, are doing that. And so you absorb these opinions, and then you sort of take them on as your own, even though you can't explain any of the reasoning behind them. And that's sort of what political platforms are in party politics, is a set of opinions that no adherent can really defend in any precise way. But, those are my opinions, and I'll die to defend them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, that's what I was going to ask. Do you consider yourself a traditionalist?
Well, I suppose as far as the deepest identity, as far as ideas and impulses, I'd say I consider myself a Catholic first and foremost as far as identity goes. And so there are, I would suppose I give that say sometimes over anything that Rene Guénon says. I'll take it with a grain of salt, although I don't have to do that very often. So for the most part, yes, I do consider myself an exponent of the traditional school. I would say that I am a traditionalist, but they're just like the dangers of being involved in a political party. There's always problems with that. I mean, I don't want to really be grouped in with Julius Evola. Mm-hmm. I do enjoy Julius Evola. Some of his stuff is phenomenal. He's phenomenal in some areas, but there's a lot of places he goes that I don't really have much interest in following him. So so there's those problems, but I suppose for the most part, yeah, I'd say I'm an exponent of traditionalism.
And what about democracy? If you don't mind me asking, do you have a preferred sort of system? Do you think other systems would become possible in the future?
I think that, if one answer to that is that we should replace democracy with something else, my ideal, my romanticized ideal would be, Christendom of the Middle Ages, some sort of modified feudalist structure. But would I transplant that here? And if I could, do I think that would work out very well? I mean, no, I think that would be catastrophic. I don't think there's any chance of bringing that. However, whatever its development was and however healthy it was, I probably don't, have all the insights I need to know that. But it's, wrapped up in the traditionalist view of history. And this, it seems obvious to me, and I hold it, as a certainty that history does not go from the Dark Ages to, proceed along the lines of progress and everything gets better and mankind gets wiser and so on until we are just, in some sort of utopia, which is sort of the universal view of history. The traditionalist view would turn that on its head. We don't have evolution, we have devolution. Things are going from perfection to chaos and destruction. You start, that's what all the religions teach anyway, which is, surprising that isn't often acknowledged, that you start in the Garden of Eden. You start in perfection. Everything is sort of put in place and ordered precisely as it should be. And then from there, it pretty much all goes downhill. And so this view that we are, that I have it better than anyone else has at any other historical period is completely absurd in that context, in that general understanding of the trajectory of history. And so the reason I sort of go off on that tangent is because democracy itself can pretty easily be envisioned as the most primitive form of government. I think it was Erich von Kuhnhoff-Leden said something like, if 7 out of 10 cavemen wanted to implement some policy, it's really easy to imagine them forcing the other 3 to do it, either by, withholding food or just killing them or something along those lines. And other anthropologists have said, democracy is actually one of the first phases. It's not some new discovery. People have been talking about democracy since political philosophy was a thing. So I suppose what I'm saying is that transplanting something from maybe way back in history that was appropriate to a more well-ordered phase in the unfolding of history to now, when, according to the traditionalist view, we're dealing with a different type of human being. Anthropology is not some sort of static thing. And so the type of person that you would be sort of imposing that order, although that order might be sort of in principle superior, would be inappropriate and would never work. If modern people have turned to liberalism because they have lost the ability to sense the supernatural or, anything beyond immanence, or at least, are only capable of dealing mostly with the material world, then, putting divine authority back in place is going to be disastrous, mostly because the people that will be responsible for that level will be subject to the same conditions, and they will not do very well. So I guess that's a long way of saying I don't know that I have the answer. If entropy is increasing, which I think that it is, then there's probably not a really good answer, except that, things are going to probably continue to disintegrate. And if the cyclical view of history is correct, then we will sort of transition into some sort of a new order, but things might have to be reduced to their lowest levels, socially speaking, before we start to rebuild, and it would be very difficult to foresee what that rebuilding will look like.
Okay. Is there anything you would like to add about your book or your work that you, specifically this book or Traditionalism, which you feel we need to sort of add in to this conversation?
Oh, I don't think I have anything significant that is necessary. I mean, it's largely a negative, work in the sense of being so many points attacking the myths of the modern world. And in some places it does give, the traditionalist view, but something that I do hope to do and that I am working on, whether or not it will ever, actually be published, is the extension of that same book into something that is a little bit more comprehensive and a little bit more positive and adds, maybe practice into the theory, ways to live this out and not just make yourself an irrelevant person. Because right now, if you read that book, and even if you accepted everything, you'd just be more alienated than you were when you started. And that's not necessary. I don't feel that way. And it warrants about another few installments before it can be what I would like it to be.
Are you working on that now?
I am. But right now it's a little bit unwieldy. It's right now the draft that I have of what might be that at some point is at 1,500 pages long. The last time I sort of tried to gather it and collate it together. And so for starters, I sort of stepped back from trying to publish things publicly. This Case Against the Modern World was me sort of tapering off from an enthusiastic attempt to get my writing out there. And now I'm appreciating traditional anonymity a little bit more. Almost, not just as something you accept, but almost as an ideal. And so I'm not in any hurry to publish anything at this time. So, I like the idea of doing it at some point, but it would be quite a project. And right now it's mostly shown to family and for family.
And whereabouts can we purchase your work?
That is all available on Amazon.com right now. So that would really be the place. It's self-published, or there is one book that is through a small Catholic publishing house, but they still sell through Amazon.com. Just that's the kind of the way of the publishing world right now.
Okay. That seems like a good place to finish up. So Daniel Schwindt, thanks very much.
Thank you, James. I appreciate it.